Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, thank you very much. In my view, something significant happened yesterday in the House of Representatives. I'm pleased with the outcome of the passage of cut, cap, and balance. I think we have a serious responsibility here in the United States Congress to see that we address the economic circumstances we find ourselves in. And certainly the way we do that is important. I'm one who believes that it would be irresponsible not to address the debt ceiling. But I also believe that it would be irresponsible only to address the debt ceiling without adequately taking into account the economic circumstances we're in and the tremendous debt that our country faces. There is no way that we can continue down the path that we are on. And while it's easy for us to make accusations, the reality is that this country, through its Congress and through various administrations, have overspent year after year after year. The fact that 42 cents of every dollar that we spend is now borrowed tells us that we cannot continue down that path. One of my town hall meetings this past weekend back in Kansas, the suggestion was we're willing to take a cut in what benefits we get from government, but let's do this in a fair way and let's just do an across-the-board reduction in federal spending. And the suggestion by the constituent was, well, maybe if we all just took 5% off of what we receive, we'd be fine. Well, I appreciate that attitude, but it fails to recognize the magnitude of the problem. Reducing federal spending by 5% across the board will not get us out of the financial circumstance that we're in, will not restore fiscal sanity to our nation. And so while we are about, between now and August the 2nd, seeing what we can do to raise the debt ceiling, in my view, we have to come together with a plan that addresses the long-term financial condition of our federal government. I'm a supporter of cut, cap, and balance, and was pleased by the broad support that that legislation received in the House. It's my understanding that we will now consider that legislation here in the Senate this week, but I already read the press reports and the political pundits who say that legislation is dead on arrival in the Senate. Well, I would encourage my colleagues not to reach that conclusion. It may be the one and only path we have to succeed in getting accomplished what we need to accomplish in the next 2 weeks. And it may be that this is one of the, if not the only one of the very few measures that would pass the House of Representatives. We have now received in the Senate a message that says this is something that we are willing to do. And for a long time, I've been told as a senator, there is nothing that will pass the House of Representatives that raises the debt ceiling. And yet we saw last night that wasn't the case. So let's not be so quick to say that the Senate will not address and seriously consider and potentially pass legislation based upon cut, cap, and balance. In some circles, this concept of cut, cap, and balance is considered radical, extreme. Cutting spending is not extreme. That's what every Kansas family does when the budget gets too tight, when we've overspent, when the credit cards are maxed. We reduce our spending. You know, it's unlikely that we could go out and say, I need a raise to solve our problems. Our employers are not that sympathetic. We ought not be so quick to say we need a raise. We ought to say, what can we find within government that we can reduce, that we can cut? The idea of capping is certainly not radical. For the last 60 years, our country has averaged 18% of the gross national product in spending by the federal government. In the last couple of years, that average has increased to 24, 25%. It would not be radical to move us back to the days in which we were living with 18%, which seems to me to be a significant percentage, if we would go back to the days in which only 18% of our gross national product was spent by the federal government. And finally, balancing the budget, that's not a radical idea. Amending the United States Constitution, in my view, ought to be done rarely and with great regard for this divinely inspired document. But the Constitution allows for an amendment process. And in fact, it's been utilized to solve many of our country's problems and challenges over the time of history. And it's not radical. 49 states have provisions that require them to have a balanced budget in some form or another at the end of the year. And so amending the United States Constitution to say we're not ever going to get back in the mess that we're in today certainly is worth pursuing. I think perhaps of the cut, cap, and balance provisions, perhaps it's the constitutional amendment that's the most controversial among my colleagues. And I certainly would express an interest to work with others to find the right constitutional amendment, the right language in an amendment to the United States Constitution that met their concerns. And so this cut, cap, and balance seems to me to be the path forward, and the Senate should pass a version of cut, cap, and balance to not only allow the debt ceiling to be raised, but to allow the debt ceiling to be raised only if we become responsible stewards of American taxpayer dollars. I actually have a fourth component of cut, cap, and balance. I would say it's cut, cap, balance, and grow. The last time our fiscal house was in solvency, was solvent, was back at the end of President Clinton's administration. And in part, Republicans and Democrats couldn't get along well enough in those days to spend more money on big programs. There was legislation that was passed that supported in a bipartisan way by President Clinton and Republicans in Congress to limit spending, and so there was some spending restraint. But the reality is the last time we had our fiscal house in order and we're spending less money than we were taking in was at a time in which the economy was growing. If we really want to address the issue of balancing our budget, we should focus much more attention than we have on growing the economy, putting people to work, and allowing, as they work, that the taxes will be collected. The greatest opportunity we have to improve people's lives is to create an environment in which jobs are created, in which employers feel comfortable in investing in the future, in buying plant and equipment and putting people to work. And so while it's cut, cap, and balance today, we need to make certain we don't forget, in my view, that fourth component, grow the economy. And in my view, that means a tax code that is certain and fair, that doesn't change, that is something that a business person, a family can rely upon. And it's also a regulatory environment that allows businesses to have the opportunity to grow their business. The most common conversation I have with a business owner in Kansas, walking through a manufacturing plant, some small business that manufactures a piece of agriculture equipment, that's pretty common in our state. The most common conversation I have is, Senator, what next is government going to do that puts me out of business? If that's the mindset, how do we ever expect that business person to reach the conclusion that they have the faith in the future to invest in their plant and equipment and in hiring new employees? And we need to make certain that our financial institutions, particularly our community banks, are not hamstrung by significant regulations that discourage them from making loans and create uncertainty about the ability to do that. So a tax, regulatory, and access to credit environment that says now is the time to invest in America and to put people to work. So, Mr. President, I'm here to urge my colleagues to seriously consider, not dismiss, cut, cap, and balance, and upon its passage for us to immediately return to a pro-growth agenda that allows for people to have the faith that the future of their country is bright, and we return us to the opportunity in which the next generation of Americans can understand that the American dream can still be lived. I thank the President for the consideration of speaking on the Senate floor today, and I yield back my time.
Mr. President. Senator from South Dakota. Mr. President, I appreciate the good words of my colleague from Kansas. He comes from a state where they understand that the role of the government should be limited. They understand the importance of living within your means, of not spending money that you don't have. And I suspect that the senator from Kansas has had a long and distinguished career in public life, but before coming to Washington, D.C. to serve in Congress, also was a state legislator. And my guess is that when he was a member of the state legislature in Kansas, that they had to balance their budget every year. And I would ask my colleague, Mr. President, if he could perhaps shed some light on what his state of Kansas does year in and year out in order to get their budget balanced, to make sure that they're not spending more than they take in. I think that's, as he pointed out, something that most families in Kansas, I would say most families in my state of South Dakota, those are decisions they have to grapple with all the time. and you don't always have the luxury of being able to just borrow more. Most states don't allow that. My state of South Dakota doesn't allow that. And also certainly not in our states probably very conducive to saying we're just going to raise taxes on people and on small businesses, which requires then that we've got to make hard decisions about spending. And I would just, through the chair, ask my colleague from Kansas if perhaps that might have been the way they went about dealing with their fiscal crisis in the past.
Mr. President, I thank the gentleman from South Dakota and would indicate that, yes, Kansas is one of those states, one of those 49 states. In our Constitution, we are prohibited in almost all ways of living beyond our means. And it's been something that the Kansas legislature and governor has lived with throughout the history of our state, including in today's environment where an economic downturn creates the circumstance in which there is less revenues. And so the solution to the problem in Kansas is not a cry for more revenue. It's a recognition that spending in difficult times has to be reduced. It's the restraint that we desperately need in Washington, D.C. that's so common in state capitals and families and businesses across the country. And so while I've always indicated to Kansans, while we have this debate every year about how to balance the revenues with the expenditures, and it's not an enjoyable debate, we are fortunate in Kansas that we have to reach that conclusion, and it's something that we need in Washington, D.C. For a long time, the political talk of Washington is that we're too likely to spend and tax. Well, there's also a problem of spending and borrowing, and we are now suffering the consequence, and we are not immune from what we see in Greece and Italy and Portugal and Ireland. If we do not solve this problem that we face today in a responsible way, it will be solved for us by the markets, by those who we borrow money from, determining we are no longer credit worthy. We don't have to worry so much about that in Kansas because we have a constitutional provision that requires our legislature and governor to reach the right conclusion. And it's why I thought the debt ceiling was the opportunity for us to force ourselves. This debate on the debt ceiling was the opportunity for us to force ourselves to do the things that politicians don't always like to do. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, just to the point that the senator from Kansas was making, you talked about higher interest rates and the impact of not dealing with the fiscal circumstances the country finds itself in. And you look at what's happening in Europe. 3-year government bond interest rates are around 19.4% for Portugal, 28.9% for Greece, and 12.9% for Ireland. Now, think about the impact in this country. If we had interest rates go back to what is even a 20-year average, we would see an additional $5 trillion, just about $5 trillion in additional borrowing costs in the next decade alone. That's if we went back to the 20-year historical average for this country. Not to mention going to what they're looking at in countries like Europe at these 19-20% interest rates. I mean, think about auto loans, think about home loans, think about student loans, think about business loans, all those things that we rely on in our economy and that families across this country rely on in order to carry on with their daily lives. If you were looking at those kinds of interest rates, well, that's the type of interest rate sensitivity that we have, and if we don't get our fiscal house in order, we could very well end up like many of these countries, and that would be devastating for our economy. And the most important thing that we can be doing right now, Mr. President, and the senator from Kansas pointed this out, is we need to put policies in place that actually grow the economy and create jobs. Now, I'm also will support the cut, cap, and balance proposal that's before the Senate today because I think it does important things. It cuts spending today immediately. It caps spending in the near term and puts in place a process by which we balance the budget in the long term, a balanced budget amendment. And it's interesting to know, if you go back historically, I want to read something for you, Mr. President, that President Ronald Reagan said 29 years ago this week. He led a rally of thousands of people on the Capitol steps calling for a balanced budget amendment. And this is what he said, and I quote, "Crisis is a much abused word today, but can we deny we face a crisis?" End quote. That's 29 years ago at a time, Mr. President, when the federal debt was $1 trillion. We face a debt 14 times as high, $14 trillion, and under the President's budget would literally double in the next decade. We have got to get our fiscal house and our spending in order. The senator from Kansas also mentioned the size of government as a percentage of our entire economy. If you go back to 1800, the formation, the early years of our country, 2% is what we spent on the federal government, 2% of our total economy. This year we're over 24%, in that 24 to 25% range. If you look at the 40-year historical average, it's about 20.6% is what we have spent as a percent of our entire economy. What does that mean? It means we are spending more at the federal level and that the private economy is shrinking relative to our total economy. What we want to see, Mr. President, is an expansion of the private economy, where we put policies in place that enable our job creators to create jobs, and that we get the federal government smaller, not larger. My view is when you're looking at a debt crisis like we are in this country, that you don't grow and expand the size of government, you make government smaller. You get the private economy growing and expanding and creating jobs. That is how you ultimately get out of this situation. Well, we've got policies in place right now that are making it more difficult and more expensive, I would argue, for our small businesses to create jobs. Anywhere you go in the country, in my state of South Dakota, elsewhere, you talk to small business owners, you talk to farmers and ranchers, what they will tell you is the policies, the regulations, the taxes coming out of Washington, D.C. make it more expensive and more difficult for our job creators to create jobs. And if you look at the data on that, it's pretty clear. I mean, since this president took office, we've got higher unemployment by about 18%. We've got 2.1 million more people unemployed than we did when he took office. We have a 35% higher debt. We saw spending go up in the last 2 years alone, non-defense discretionary spending by 24%. The number of people who are receiving food stamps in this country is up by 40%. All the data, all the tools by which we can measure economic progress and growth demonstrate that the policies that have been put in place by this administration have been a complete failure. And so what we need, Mr. President, is a change in policies. And it starts by capping federal spending or cutting federal spending, capping it in the near term, and putting in place a long-term solution, a balanced budget amendment, like so many states have in place, like the senator from Kansas mentioned that they have in his state of Kansas, like we have in my state of South Dakota, where our state governments have to live within their means. They cannot spend money they do not have. That is the problem that we have here in Washington, D.C. today. Now, in terms of our small businesses, there was a survey that was done by the Chamber of Commerce a couple of weeks ago in which they found that 64% of the small businesses who responded to the survey said that they're not going to hire this year. 12% actually said they're going to cut jobs. Why? Half of the small businesses listed economic uncertainty as the major reason. They are concerned about what's going to come out of Washington, D.C. They don't know what the policies and the regulations that are going to be imposed on them and what it's going to do to their cost of doing business. And as a consequence, they are just hunkering down and trying to survive. We need to change that. We change that by getting federal spending under control. Cut, cap, and balance is an important step in that process. And I'm pleased that the House of Representatives last night passed it, sent it over here to the Senate. We'll have an opportunity to vote on that in the next few days, Mr. President. And I would argue to my colleagues that this is fundamentally the best thing that we can be doing to get not only our fiscal house in order and get it on a more sustainable path going forward, but also to help get our economy growing again and get jobs created out there. You can't do it by making government larger. If that was the case, the $1 trillion stimulus bill that was passed last year would have brought unemployment down. But as we all know, we're facing 9.2% unemployment today. We continue to see an economy that is struggling, that's growing at a very slow rate. We need to unleash that economy, and the way that we do that is by capping or cutting spending in Washington, D.C., making federal government smaller, not larger, getting that amount of spending as a percentage of our entire economy back into a more historical norm, working to ensure that taxes and regulations stay low on our job creators in this country. And that's why I just fundamentally object to what the President and many of his allies here in Congress want to do with regard to the debt crisis, and that is increase revenues. You cannot create jobs in this country. You cannot grow the economy by increasing taxes on our job creators. I can't think of a single tax that you could put on our economy that actually would help create jobs. It will have the opposite effect, Mr. President. It will make it more difficult for small businesses to create jobs, more difficult for us to get out of this economic downturn. I hope my colleagues will support cut, cap, and balance, and that we'll get a big vote here in the Senate and get this country back on a more sound fiscal footing and on a path where we can create jobs and get this economy growing. Mr. President, I yield the floor.